The desert heat shimmered off the tarmac at Bagram Airfield as Staff Sergeant Maria Santos wiped the sweat from her brow with the back of her grease-stained hand. The A-10 Thunderbolt II loomed above her like a sleeping giant, its distinctive twin engines and straight wings casting long shadows across the maintenance bay. She had been working on the 30mm GAU-8 Avenger cannon for the better part of 3 hours, her small frame partially hidden beneath the aircraft's nose as she methodically disassembled the weapon system that had jammed during yesterday's close air support mission. Maria had always been different from the other mechanics in the 455th Air Expeditionary Wing. While most of her colleagues were men who towered over her 5'4" frame, she had earned their respect through sheer skill and an unwavering attention to detail that bordered on obsessive. Her hands moved with the precision of a surgeon as she examined each component of the cannon's feed system, searching for the malfunction that had nearly cost a ground patrol their lives when the weapon failed to fire during a Taliban ambush. The hangar buzzed with activity around her. F-16s were being prepped for evening sorties, their pilots conducting pre-flight checks while ground crews swarmed over the aircraft like worker bees. The familiar sounds of hydraulic systems, pneumatic tools, and shouted instructions created a symphony that Maria had grown to love over her 8 years in the Air Force. This was her world, where rank mattered less than competence, and where a young woman from East LA could prove that she belonged among the best aircraft maintainers in the military. As she worked, Maria's mind wandered to the letter she had received from her younger brother Miguel just that morning. He had written about their neighborhood, about how things were getting worse with each passing month. Gang violence had escalated, and several of their childhood friends had been caught up in the chaos. Some had joined the gangs, others had become victims. Miguel's words had been carefully chosen, but Maria could read between the lines. He was scared, and he was running out of options. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was half a world away, maintaining weapons designed to protect American soldiers, while her own family faced a different kind of war on the streets where she had grown up. But this was exactly why she had enlisted. The military had given her a purpose, a skill set, and a way to honor something greater than herself. Every bolt she tightened, every system she repaired, potentially saved lives. It was meaningful work, even when it was covered in grease and performed under the relentless Afghan sun. Maria's concentration was broken by the sound of approaching footsteps. She glanced up to see Airman First Class Tommy Rodriguez walking toward her workstation, carrying a toolbox and wearing the same expression of controlled urgency that meant they had received new orders. "Santos, we just got word from the flight line," Tommy said, setting down his tools. "Colonel Morrison wants this bird ready to fly in 4 hours. Intel says there's a convoy pinned down about 60 clicks north of here, and they need close air support ASAP." Maria nodded, understanding the weight of what Tommy had just told her. Somewhere out there, American soldiers were under fire, counting on air support that would only be effective if she could get this cannon working perfectly. The responsibility was both terrifying and energizing. "What's the status on the ammunition feed?" she asked, ducking back under the aircraft. "Chief Martinez is handling that. He said to tell you the hydraulics check out fine, so it's definitely something in the cannon assembly." Maria had suspected as much. The GAU-8 was a complex piece of machinery, capable of firing 3,900 rounds per minute of 30mm ammunition that could tear through enemy armor like paper. When it worked properly, it was devastating. When it didn't, pilots were left with only their training and smaller weapons to support troops on the ground. She had discovered her talent for aircraft maintenance almost by accident. Growing up in East LA, Maria had spent countless hours in her Uncle Carlos's auto repair shop, learning to diagnose problems by sound, feel, and intuition. Cars and fighter jets operated on many of the same principles, she had discovered. Both required someone who could think systematically, who could visualize how complex mechanical systems worked together, and who had the patience to methodically eliminate possibilities until the root cause of a problem revealed itself. But aircraft maintenance was different from automotive work in one crucial way: the stakes. When a car broke down, someone might be late for work or stranded on the side of the road. When a fighter jet malfunctioned, people died. That reality had driven Maria to become one of the best troubleshooters in her squadron. She refused to sign off on any aircraft unless she was absolutely certain it would perform flawlessly when called upon. As she worked, carefully removing the cannon's bolt assembly, Maria thought about the pilot who would be flying this mission. Captain Sarah Mitchell was one of the most experienced A-10 pilots in the squadron, with over 200 combat hours and a reputation for being able to put ordnance exactly where it needed to go. Maria had worked on Captain Mitchell's aircraft before and had developed a professional respect for the pilot's skill and dedication. The two women had never spoken extensively, but Maria had observed how Captain Mitchell interacted with her ground crew. Unlike some pilots who treated maintainers as interchangeable parts in the military machine, Captain Mitchell took time to understand her aircraft's systems and to appreciate the work that went into keeping her flying. She would often stop by the maintenance bay to check on repair progress, not because she didn't trust the mechanics, but because she understood that her life depended on their expertise. Maria finally located the problem: a hairline crack in one of the cannon's firing pin assemblies. The crack was so small it would have been easy to miss, but it was enough to cause intermittent failures that could prove fatal in combat. She carefully documented the defect and began the process of installing a replacement part, working with the methodical precision that had become her trademark. The replacement process was delicate work that required both technical skill and physical strength. The firing pin assembly was heavy and awkward to maneuver in the confined space beneath the A-10's nose. Maria had to contort her body into uncomfortable positions while maintaining the steady hands necessary to align sensitive components. Sweat dripped steadily from her forehead as she worked, but she maintained her focus, knowing that even the smallest mistake could result in another malfunction. Around her, the maintenance bay continued its controlled chaos. Other mechanics worked on different aircraft, each focused on their own critical repairs. The squadron's maintenance chief, Master Sergeant Williams, moved between workstations like an orchestra conductor, coordinating efforts and ensuring that every aircraft would be ready when needed. His presence was reassuring. Williams had over 20 years of experience and had served in every major conflict since the Gulf War. If he was confident they could meet their deadline, then they could meet their deadline. As Maria worked on the final adjustments to the firing pin assembly, she became aware of someone standing nearby. She looked up to see Colonel Morrison himself, the wing commander, observing her work. Colonel Morrison was a tall, imposing figure with graying hair and intense blue eyes that seemed to miss nothing. He had a reputation as a demanding leader who expected excellence from everyone under his command, but who also took care of his people and understood the realities of combat operations. "Staff Sergeant Santos," the colonel said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "Master Sergeant Williams tells me you've identified the problem with this aircraft's cannon system." "Yes, sir," Maria replied, straightening up and unconsciously coming to attention despite being covered in grease and hydraulic fluid. "Hairline crack in the firing pin assembly. I've installed a replacement and I'm conducting final function checks now." Colonel Morrison nodded, his expression unreadable. "How confident are you that this aircraft will perform as required?" It was a direct question that demanded an honest answer. In the military, especially in combat zones, there was no room for false confidence or covering up uncertainties. Lives depended on accurate assessments of equipment readiness. "Very confident, sir," Maria replied without hesitation. "I've tested the system multiple times, and all parameters are within specifications. The aircraft is fully mission capable." "Good," the colonel said. "Captain Mitchell speaks very highly of your work, Santos. She specifically requested that you be the one to sign off on this aircraft's cannon system." Maria felt a surge of pride at the compliment, but she kept her expression neutral. In the military, praise from senior officers was rare and meaningful. The fact that Captain Mitchell had specifically requested her work spoke volumes about the reputation she had built within the squadron. As Colonel Morrison prepared to leave, something caught his eye. Maria was reaching up to make a final adjustment to the cannon assembly, and her uniform sleeve had pulled back slightly, revealing a tattoo on her left forearm. The colonel stopped moving, his eyes fixed on the intricate design that was partially visible beneath her rolled-up sleeve. The tattoo was unlike anything the colonel had expected to see on one of his maintainers. It was beautifully crafted, depicting a pair of angel wings surrounding a young boy's face. The artistry was exceptional, with delicate shading and fine details that spoke of significant time and expense. But it was the expression on the boy's face that had caught the colonel's attention. There was something familiar about those features, something that triggered a memory he couldn't quite place. Maria noticed the colonel's intense stare and quickly pulled down her sleeve, covering the tattoo completely. She had always been careful to keep her personal life separate from her military service, and the tattoo represented something deeply private that she rarely discussed with anyone. "Is there anything else you need, sir?" she asked, hoping to redirect the colonel's attention back to the aircraft. But Colonel Morrison seemed lost in thought, his mind clearly elsewhere. For a long moment, he stared at the spot where the tattoo had been visible, his expression cycling through confusion, recognition, and what looked like shock. "Sir?" Maria repeated, beginning to feel uncomfortable under his intense scrutiny. The colonel blinked, seeming to return to the present moment. "No, Staff Sergeant. Carry on with your work." But, as he walked away, Maria could see that he was troubled by something. She had no way of knowing that her tattoo had just unlocked a memory that Colonel Morrison had been trying to forget for over 15 years. A memory of a young boy in a hospital bed, fighting for his life while his family maintained a desperate vigil in the waiting room. The image of those angel wings and that young face had transported the colonel back to a time and place he had tried hard to leave behind. A time when he wasn't a wing commander responsible for combat operations, but simply a young captain trying to help a family cope with an unimaginable tragedy. As Maria completed her work on the A-10’s cannon system, she had no idea that her carefully hidden tattoo had just changed everything. The symbol she had chosen to honor someone she had lost was about to connect her to her commanding officer in a way that neither of them could have anticipated. The mission was still 4 hours away, but Colonel Morrison had already begun to understand that this particular aircraft, piloted by Captain Mitchell and maintained by Staff Sergeant Santos, was going to be more than just another combat sortie. It was going to be the beginning of a story that would test everything he thought he knew about duty, sacrifice, and the unexpected ways that lives intersect in the military. Maria secured her tools and began the final paperwork that would officially return the A-10 to flight status. As she worked, she noticed that her hands were shaking slightly, though she couldn't understand why. The encounter with Colonel Morrison had left her feeling unsettled, as if something significant had just happened that she didn't fully comprehend. Around her, the maintenance bay continued its relentless pace of preparation. Other aircraft were being readied for their own missions, each one representing the dedication and skill of dozens of maintainers, pilots, and support personnel. But, for Maria, this particular aircraft had become something more than just another job. It had become a reminder that the past has a way of reaching into the present, even when you think you've left it safely behind. The tattoo on her arm, hidden once again beneath her uniform sleeve, seemed to pulse with significance as she finished her work. Soon, Captain Mitchell would climb into the cockpit of this A-10 and fly off into the Afghan sky, carrying weapons that Maria had personally ensured would function perfectly when called upon. But neither Maria nor Colonel Morrison yet understood how profoundly their brief encounter would change both of their lives, or how a tattoo meant to honor the memory of someone lost would end up revealing connections that neither of them had ever imagined possible. Colonel James Morrison sat in his office long after the maintenance bay had quieted down, staring at a photograph on his desk that he rarely allowed himself to look at anymore. The picture showed him 15 years younger, wearing the uniform of an army captain, standing beside a hospital bed where a small boy lay connected to various machines. The boy's mother sat on one side of the bed, her face etched with exhaustion and desperate hope, while the boy's sister, perhaps 8 years old, held his hand and whispered something in his ear. The colonel's hands trembled slightly as he picked up the photograph. The little boy in the picture was David Santos, and the girl holding his hand was his older sister, Maria. The same Maria Santos who now served as one of his most skilled aircraft maintainers, though she had no idea that he had been there during the worst days of her family's life. It had been during Colonel Morrison's deployment with an Army Civil Affairs unit in Los Angeles, part of a community outreach program designed to build relationships between the military and inner-city neighborhoods. He had been assigned to work with families who had lost members to gang violence, helping them navigate the complex bureaucracy of victim services and providing support during their darkest hours. The Santos family had been referred to his program after 8-year-old David was caught in the crossfire of a drive-by shooting. The boy had been walking home from school when rival gang members opened fire on a group standing outside a corner store. 3 bullets had struck David, and, while the surgeries had saved his life, the damage to his spinal cord was extensive. The doctors had been honest about the prognosis: David would likely never walk again. Colonel Morrison remembered how the family had rallied around David during those terrible weeks in the hospital. Maria, only 10 years old at the time, had refused to leave her brother's side. She would read to him, help him with the physical therapy exercises, and constantly reassure him that everything would be okay. Her strength and maturity had been remarkable for such a young girl, and Colonel Morrison had found himself deeply moved by her devotion to her younger brother. The tattoo he had glimpsed on Maria's arm suddenly made perfect sense. The angel wings and the young boy's face were David, her brother, who had died 2 years after the shooting from complications related to his injuries. Colonel Morrison had attended the funeral, standing in the back of the crowded church while the Santos family said goodbye to a boy who had never had the chance to grow up. Now, 15 years later, that same little girl had grown up to become one of his most trusted maintainers, responsible for weapons systems that protected American soldiers in combat. The irony was profound. Maria had joined the military to escape the violence that had taken her brother's life, only to find herself maintaining instruments of war in one of the most dangerous places on earth. Colonel Morrison closed his eyes and tried to reconcile the image of the fierce 10-year-old girl who had never left her brother's side with the professional, competent sergeant who had just completed critical repairs on an A-10. The connection felt surreal, like discovering that someone he had known in a completely different context had been working under his command all along. He remembered the conversation he had had with Maria's mother, Carmen Santos, during one of his visits to the hospital. She had spoken about her fears for her children, about how the neighborhood was becoming more dangerous each year, and about her dreams of getting her family somewhere safe. She had particularly worried about Maria, who was showing signs of anger and defiance that Carmen feared might lead her down the wrong path. "She's so angry about what happened to David," Carmen had said, her voice heavy with exhaustion. "She doesn't understand why bad things happen to good people. I'm afraid she might do something stupid, trying to get revenge or prove that she's tough enough to survive in this neighborhood." Colonel Morrison had offered what comfort he could, providing information about counseling services and educational programs that might help the family. But he had always wondered what had happened to Maria after David's death, whether she had found a positive outlet for her anger or had been consumed by the same violence that had claimed her brother. Now he had his answer. Maria had channeled her pain into purpose, using the military as a way to honor her brother's memory while building a life far removed from the streets that had taken him. Her dedication to her work, her insistence on perfection in everything she did, suddenly made perfect sense. She wasn't just maintaining aircraft, she was fighting against the chaos and violence that had shaped her childhood. A knock at his office door interrupted the colonel's thoughts. Master Sergeant Williams entered, carrying a clipboard with maintenance reports from the day's activities. "Sir, all aircraft are green for tomorrow's operations. Staff Sergeant Santos completed the cannon repairs on Warthog 77, and Captain Mitchell has signed off on the pre-flight inspection." "Thank you, Master Sergeant," Colonel Morrison replied, carefully placing the photograph back on his desk. "Tell me about Santos. What kind of maintainer is she?" Williams looked slightly surprised by the question. "One of the best I've ever worked with, sir. She's got an eye for detail that's almost supernatural, and she never rushes a job. If Santos signs off on an aircraft, you can bet your life it's going to perform exactly as designed." "How does she get along with the other maintainers?" "Well respected, sir. She doesn't socialize much, keeps to herself mostly, but everyone trusts her work. She's helped train several of our newer airmen, and she's never hesitated to take on the most difficult repairs." Williams paused, then added, "If you don't mind me asking, sir, is there some kind of problem with her performance?" "No, quite the opposite," Colonel Morrison said. "I'm just trying to understand the people under my command better." "Has she ever mentioned her family or her background?" Williams shook his head. "Not that I've heard. She's pretty private about personal matters. Professional to the core, but not much for small talk about life outside the Air Force." After Williams left, Colonel Morrison found himself facing a dilemma he had never anticipated. Military regulations were clear about maintaining professional boundaries between commanders and subordinates, but this situation fell into a gray area that his training hadn't covered. Should he acknowledge their shared history? Should he tell Maria that he remembered her family and had been present during one of the most difficult periods of her life? Part of him wanted to reach out, to let her know that he understood something about the path that had brought her to this point. But another part of him recognized that Maria had clearly chosen to keep her past private, and that revealing his knowledge might feel like an invasion of her carefully constructed boundaries. Meanwhile, in the maintenance bay, Maria was completing the final paperwork for the A-10 repairs, but her mind kept drifting back to her encounter with Colonel Morrison. There had been something in his expression when he saw her tattoo, a recognition that went beyond casual interest. She had spent years perfecting her professional mask, keeping her personal history separate from her military service, but something about the colonel's reaction suggested that her past might not be as hidden as she had believed. The tattoo was her most closely guarded secret, visible only when she rolled up her sleeves during particularly intensive work. She had gotten it shortly after David's death, using money she had saved from her part-time job at a local grocery store. The artist had been reluctant to tattoo someone so young, but Maria had been insistent, and her grief had been so obvious that he had eventually agreed. The design had taken months to complete, with multiple sessions to achieve the level of detail that Maria had demanded. The angel wings were positioned to look like they were embracing David's face, which was rendered with photographic accuracy based on her favorite picture of her brother. Below the wings, in script so small it was barely visible, were the words "Para siempre," forever. For Maria, the tattoo was more than just body art, it was a promise. A promise that she would never forget David, never stop fighting against the forces that had taken him, and never let his death be meaningless. Every time she looked at it, she was reminded of why she had joined the Air Force, why she pushed herself to excel, and why she refused to accept anything less than perfection in her work. But now, for the first time since getting the tattoo, Maria felt like someone else might understand its significance. The way Colonel Morrison had stared at it, the shock and recognition in his eyes, suggested that he had seen something more than just an artistic rendering of angel wings and a young boy's face. As she finished her paperwork and prepared to head back to her quarters, Maria made a decision. She would research Colonel Morrison's background, try to understand why her tattoo had affected him so strongly. If there was some connection between them that she wasn't aware of, she needed to know what it was. The base library was quiet at this hour, with only a few personnel using the computers for personal correspondence or entertainment. Maria found a terminal in a corner where she could work without being observed and began searching for information about Colonel Morrison's career history. What she found surprised her. Before becoming an Air Force officer, James Morrison had served as an Army captain in a civil affairs unit. His assignments had included community outreach work in urban areas with high crime rates, particularly in Los Angeles. The timeline matched perfectly with David's shooting and subsequent hospitalization. Maria felt her heart rate increase as she read through more detailed information about Morrison's work with victim families. His unit had been specifically tasked with providing support to families affected by gang violence, helping them navigate the complex systems of medical care, victim compensation, and long-term assistance programs. The pieces were beginning to fall into place. If Colonel Morrison had been working with gang violence victims in Los Angeles during 2008 and 2009, it was entirely possible that he had encountered her family during David's hospitalization and recovery. The Santos family had worked with several military personnel during that period, as part of a comprehensive support network that had helped them cope with the enormous medical bills and ongoing care requirements. But Maria's memories of that time were fragmentary and painful. She had been 10 years old, focused entirely on her brother's condition, and many of the adults who had come and gone during those months had blended together in her memory. She couldn't specifically remember meeting a young Army captain named Morrison, but that didn't mean it hadn't happened. The more she thought about it, the more sense it made. Colonel Morrison's reaction to her tattoo, his obvious recognition of the imagery, his sudden emotional distance after seeing it, all of these responses suggested someone who had known David personally, who understood what the tattoo represented. Maria left the library feeling both relieved and apprehensive. If Colonel Morrison had indeed been part of the support network during David's illness, it meant that her carefully maintained separation between her personal history and her military career had just collapsed. Her commanding officer now knew things about her past that she had never intended to share with anyone in the Air Force. Back in his quarters, Colonel Morrison was having similar thoughts. He had spent the evening reviewing Maria's personnel file, looking for any indication that she might have remembered him from their previous encounter. Her file showed exemplary performance ratings, no disciplinary issues, and consistent promotion ahead of her peers. There was nothing in the official record to suggest that she had recognized him or had any awareness of their shared history. But her reaction when he saw the tattoo suggested that she was beginning to suspect something. The way she had quickly covered it, her obvious discomfort with his attention, indicated that she understood the tattoo was significant and that his reaction to it was more than casual interest. As both Maria and Colonel Morrison tried to process this unexpected connection, neither of them could predict how it would affect their professional relationship or their personal lives. The past had a way of refusing to stay buried, especially when it involved experiences as profound as the loss of a child and the bonds formed in the face of tragedy. Tomorrow's mission would take on new significance for both of them. Captain Mitchell would fly the A-10 that Maria had repaired, carrying weapons that could mean the difference between life and death for soldiers under fire. But, for Maria and Colonel Morrison, the mission would also represent the first test of how they would handle their newly discovered connection, and whether their shared past would strengthen or complicate their professional relationship. The desert night settled over Bagram Airfield as both officer and enlisted soldier wrestled with memories they had thought were safely buried in the past, unaware that their reunion was about to reshape everything they thought they knew about duty, sacrifice, and the unexpected ways that fate brings people back together. The pre-dawn hours at Bagram Airfield carried a chill that would burn away within minutes of sunrise, but, for now, the maintenance crews worked in relative coolness as they conducted final preparations for the morning's missions. Maria had arrived at the flight line 30 minutes early, unable to sleep after spending most of the night researching Colonel Morrison's background and trying to piece together memories from the most difficult period of her life. She stood beside the A-10 she had repaired the previous day, running through her final inspection checklist with the methodical precision that had become her trademark. But her mind kept drifting to a hospital room in Los Angeles, trying to recall the faces of the various officials and volunteers who had visited her family during David's treatment. The memories were frustratingly vague, filtered through the perspective of a 10-year-old girl who had been focused entirely on her brother's condition. Captain Sarah Mitchell approached the aircraft with her usual pre-flight confidence, but Maria noticed something different in her demeanor this morning. The pilot seemed more focused than usual, more intense, as if she understood that today's mission carried special significance. "Morning, Santos," Captain Mitchell said, beginning her own visual inspection of the aircraft. "I heard you put in some extra hours yesterday getting the cannon system sorted out." "Yes, ma'am," Maria replied. "Hairline crack in the firing pin assembly. I've replaced the component and run complete function tests. The system is fully operational." Captain Mitchell nodded, running her hand along the cannon's barrel housing. "I've been flying A-10’s for 6 years, and I've learned to trust the people who keep them flying. Your work has never let me down." The compliment meant more to Maria than Captain Mitchell could have known. In a military culture that often struggled with gender equality, finding female role models who had succeeded in traditionally male-dominated fields was crucial. Captain Mitchell represented what Maria hoped to achieve in her own career: respect based on competence, leadership that inspired confidence, and the ability to perform under pressure without compromising her principles. As Captain Mitchell continued her pre-flight inspection, Maria found herself studying the pilot's face, looking for signs of the stress that everyone on the base was feeling. Intelligence reports had indicated increased Taliban activity in the region, and yesterday's convoy attack was just the latest in a series of escalating incidents. The enemy was testing NATO forces, probing for weaknesses, and the pressure on air support missions had intensified accordingly. "Captain Mitchell," Maria said, stepping closer to the pilot. "I know this might be out of line, but is there anything unusual about today's mission? You seem more focused than usual." Captain Mitchell paused in her inspection and looked directly at Maria. For a moment, the professional barriers between officer and enlisted personnel seemed to fade, replaced by the mutual respect of two professionals who understood the realities of their situation. "The convoy that got hit yesterday," Captain Mitchell said quietly. "They lost 2 soldiers before air support arrived." The investigation showed that if close air support had been available 15 minutes earlier, those men would still be alive. The weight of that statement settled over both women like a physical presence. Maria understood immediately what Captain Mitchell was telling her. Today's mission wasn't just about providing air support to troops in contact. It was about ensuring that the failures of yesterday never happened again. The cannon system will perform perfectly, Maria said with absolute conviction. I guarantee it. Captain Mitchell smiled slightly, recognizing the intensity in Maria's voice. I know it will. That's why Colonel Morrison specifically requested that you be the one to sign off on this aircraft. The mention of Colonel Morrison sent a jolt of surprise through Maria. She had assumed that her assignment to this particular aircraft was routine, but learning that the colonel had specifically requested her work added a new dimension to the situation. Before she could respond, the sound of approaching footsteps drew their attention. Colonel Morrison was walking across the tarmac with Master Sergeant Williams, heading directly toward their aircraft. Even at a distance, Maria could see the tension in the colonel's posture, the way he carried himself when dealing with high-stakes situations that could have far-reaching consequences. Captain Mitchell, Staff Sergeant Santos, the colonel said as he approached. Final status report on this aircraft? All systems green, sir, Captain Mitchell responded. Staff Sergeant Santos has certified the cannon system as fully operational, and my pre-flight inspection shows no discrepancies. Colonel Morrison turned his attention to Maria, and she felt the same unsettling intensity in his gaze that she had experienced the previous day. But, this time, there was something else in his expression, a combination of professional respect and personal concern that seemed oddly out of place in a routine operational briefing. Staff Sergeant Santos, he said, his voice carrying a formality that seemed forced. I understand you identified and corrected a potentially serious malfunction in the cannon system. Yes, sir, Maria replied, maintaining eye contact despite feeling increasingly uncomfortable. Hairline crack in the firing pin assembly. The component was replaced and tested according to technical specifications. And you're confident that the system will perform as required in combat? It was the same question he had asked the previous day, but this time it carried additional weight. Maria understood that Colonel Morrison was asking for more than a technical assessment. He was asking for her personal guarantee that the weapons system would function when soldiers' lives depended on it. Absolutely confident, sir, she said without hesitation. Colonel Morrison studied her face for a long moment, as if searching for some deeper truth in her expression. Finally, he nodded and turned to Master Sergeant Williams. Ensure that Staff Sergeant Santos is available for immediate consultation if any issues arise with this aircraft's systems, he ordered. I want her monitoring the mission from the operations center. Both Maria and Master Sergeant Williams looked surprised by this directive. Aircraft maintainers rarely observed combat missions from the operations center unless there were specific concerns about equipment reliability or unusual maintenance requirements. Sir, Williams said carefully, is there a particular concern about this aircraft's systems? I want our most experienced maintainer available if Captain Mitchell encounters any problems with the cannon system, Colonel Morrison replied. Staff Sergeant Santos knows this aircraft better than anyone, and I want her expertise readily available. As Colonel Morrison walked away, Maria found herself trying to understand why she was being given such unusual treatment. Having a maintainer monitor a mission from the operations center was typically reserved for test flights or aircraft with known reliability issues. The fact that Colonel Morrison had specifically requested her presence suggested either exceptional concern about the aircraft's condition or exceptional confidence in her abilities. Captain Mitchell finished her pre-flight inspection and began climbing into the cockpit, pausing to look down at Maria before securing her helmet. Whatever's going on between you and the Colonel, she said quietly, it's clear he trusts your work more than usual. I've never had a maintainer assigned to monitor my missions before. Maria helped Captain Mitchell with her final cockpit preparations, checking connections and ensuring that all systems were properly configured for startup. As she worked, she tried to suppress the growing feeling that today's mission was about more than providing close air support to ground forces. The A-10’s engines spooled up with their characteristic whine, and Maria stepped back as Captain Mitchell began her taxi to the runway. The aircraft looked deadly and purposeful as it moved across the tarmac, its distinctive profile unmistakable even in the early morning light. Maria felt the familiar mixture of pride and anxiety that came with watching an aircraft she had worked on prepare for a combat mission. As directed, Maria made her way to the operations center, a climate-controlled facility filled with radar screens, communication equipment, and the controlled chaos of personnel coordinating multiple simultaneous missions. She had never been inside the operations center during an active mission, and the intensity of activity was both fascinating and overwhelming. Colonel Morrison was stationed at the central command console, monitoring multiple data feeds while coordinating with ground controllers and other aircraft in the area. He looked up as Maria entered and gestured for her to take a position at a nearby monitoring station. "Staff Sergeant Santos," he said, handing her a headset. "You'll be monitoring Captain Mitchell's aircraft systems from this station. If she reports any problems with the cannon system, I want you to provide immediate troubleshooting guidance." Maria put on the headset and found herself connected to the same communication network that linked all the aircraft and ground units involved in the mission. She could hear Captain Mitchell's voice as she checked in with air traffic control, reporting her position and mission status as she flew toward the target area. For the first time in her military career, Maria was experiencing combat operations from the perspective of the commanders who coordinated missions rather than the maintainers who prepared aircraft. The complexity was staggering: multiple aircraft, ground units, intelligence reports, weather updates, and constantly changing tactical situations all had to be integrated into coherent operational decisions. "Warthog 77, this is Overlord," came the voice of the Air Operations Controller. "Proceed to grid coordinates 41 SPR 12345, 67890. Friendly forces in contact with enemy personnel, requesting immediate close air support." Maria listened as Captain Mitchell acknowledged the mission update and adjusted her flight path toward the target area. The pilot's voice was calm and professional, but Maria could hear the underlying tension that came with knowing that American soldiers were under fire and counting on her support. As Captain Mitchell approached the target area, her communications became more frequent and urgent. She was coordinating with ground forces to identify enemy positions while ensuring that her attack runs wouldn't endanger friendly troops. The precision required was enormous. The difference between hitting enemy positions and accidentally targeting friendly forces could be measured in